Now, we saw in Davos, President Trump introduced the concept of the Board of Peace. It was not popular with a number of countries, including France and Britain. But do you see any merit in a Board of Peace, and would it coexist with the UN, or ultimately could it replace the UN?
The big problem, which you know, Rita, with the UN is that its so-called peacekeeping forces routinely fail to keep the peace. We saw that, of course, in the former Yugoslavia, particularly with the Dutch military who stood aside as the Srebrenica massacre, genocide happened, and we've seen it more recently in the utter failure of the UN peacekeeping force in the south of Lebanon to stop Hezbollah activity. So I certainly wouldn't trust the UN to oversee security in the post-war Gaza period. I think there are several things that are interesting about the Board of Peace. One is that President Trump has made himself the chairman, or has been asked to be the chairman, and that shows that he's going to be committed to the success of post-war Gaza, and that itself, I think, is a good sign. Secondly, there is concern among many people at the fact that, you know, Vladimir Putin's been invited to join. The Qataris, who of course are another state sponsor of terrorism in the region and extremism, have been asked to join. But the third thing is that it is very striking that a genuine international coalition is in the process of being put together. Now, what that looks like is still unclear. There is going to have to be very, very specific oversight to stop a security oversight to stop Hamas regrouping and being able to continue their persecution and murder of Palestinians in Gaza who stand up to them. And that's going to be probably the hardest bit of the whole puzzle to solve. But there are other countries that, including the Emiratis and others, who I think will be able to help out in a meaningful way in the rebuilding process. And I think to get a regional coalition like this is a considerable diplomatic success. But of course, it's going to rely on what happens in the months and years ahead. I'm all for any new thinking on this because the status quo has been so appalling. And the UN status quo was basically that, you know, Hamas would end up rearming, you rebuild Gaza, the same thing happens again in a few years' time. And that's just not, I think that shouldn't be acceptable to anyone. So any new thinking on it, I think, is to be welcomed.
I've been wanting to ask you about this shocking story from the Netherlands, where an idealistic project to house refugees and students together in a custom-built block became a nightmare of sexual assault and violence. The scheme placed 125 students alongside 125 refugees, with residents encouraged to form buddy partnerships to help migrants adjust to Dutch society. However, testimonies from former residents shared in an investigative documentary describe repeated sexual assaults, stalking and violent confrontations. And Douglas, this nightmare endured for years because everyone seemed to be so desperate for this pioneering project to work. And it immediately, for me, brought back the grooming gang scandal in the UK. Supposedly well-intentioned people turning a blind eye to just some horrific behaviour.
Yeah, I mean, this is reminiscent of that, and sadly of many other such cases, Rita. I mean, it reminds me of cases I wrote about in The Strange Death of Europe 10 years ago now, where, for instance, I mean, there was a case I mentioned where an aid worker who worked with refugees and encouraged open borders was herself raped by some so-called refugees, migrants, and was encouraged by her colleagues not to report it and indeed to cover it up so that the narrative held. And this story from the Netherlands is very similar to that. And I think it speaks to a really big problem in our time. You have to ask the question, how many, for instance, sexual assaults do you want to cover up in order to protect the narrative that you're pushing on the people? See, I would have thought the answer is none. I think that would be the obvious one. If you stick a bunch of students beside a large number of recently arrived males from other cultures who will not share the Dutch attitudes towards sex and much more, you are going to have problems. I would have thought that the moment that the first assault happened, you scrapped the experiment. But isn't it interesting, Rita, that in all of these cases, there seems to be this belief that the foundational not, I wouldn't say myth, but the foundational belief of the society has to be held to, even if a massive number of lives are ruined along the way. And I don't think that should be the deal. I think we should be able to pivot. We should be able to reverse mistakes. We should be able to alter the course we're on if the course we're on isn't working. But we'll see, maybe the Dutch authorities, like many of the British authorities and others in recent years, will decide that there is some permissible amount of rape that you can have in your societies in order to continue the shibboleths of our time. I think it's lamentable that, and then you mentioned history earlier. I really think that when people look back at things like this, look back at the way in which in 21st century Europe we regarded people and victims of sexual violence as being just sort of easily counted up as just collateral to the prevailing ideology. I think we'll look back on that with not just bewilderment, but serious judgment.
Yes, let's hope so. Let's hope there's some lessons learned, because in the UK, it doesn't appear to be the case. Douglas Murray, thank you so much for your time tonight.
It's a great pleasure as always. Thank you.